Mr. Director General, it's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
And congratulations for your new position, but at the same time, I know there's a lot of challenges involved given the world's changed recently.
It's a very intense and very worrying world in some ways. So the big polarization that we see, I think especially of all the people that are impacted by the armed conflicts that we see around the world, whether that's in, of course, Israel and Gaza, whether that's in Sudan, for example, or the Democratic Republic of Congo, or many other places.
How would you prioritize out of this very complex current realities?
So the first priority is always that the ICRC exists. Our organization exists because for the last 160 years we have focused on men, women and children affected by the horrors of war. And that mission is so important because unfortunately armed conflicts exist around us at almost every time in the history of humankind. And the ICRC's resolute focus is on trying to bring assistance, but also to provide some respect for the integrity and safety, well-being and dignity of human beings that are caught up in these conflict environments. That's the main instrument of our prioritization. And so then we will see where are the big visible conflicts, like today in Ukraine, for example, or again in Gaza, in Sudan, but where are the many forgotten conflict environments where few people are paying attention to, and yet many lives are being lost as well. So ICRC always tries to combine in its role and in its work the attention to all these communities.
I would love to explore some of these important areas you just mentioned. Let's talk about the crisis so far, especially the two wars. The Middle East one has recently been very much the focus of attention for everyone, and the conflict there has already risen to a new high. But stakeholders are also trying to come up with consensus, at least for some ceasefires. Your organization is there on the ground. You were earlier having also experiences working in the region. Tell me more about how would you assess the current realities?
In human terms, it's a disastrous reality. And I think, first of all, the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, between the reality of the occupied Palestinian territories has been, of course, a long-lasting conflict. But all the events that we have seen since October 7 last year have been extremely dramatic, and ICRC has called repeatedly, for example, for the release of hostages. But we've also called for much better respect of international humanitarian law, and the impact on the civilian population in the Gaza Strip has been absolutely devastating. So this tells us several stories. One is that respecting international humanitarian law is an obligation for all parties, and states should absolutely ensure that that is respected, because it makes the practical difference between lives lost and lives preserved, in the way in which military operations are conducted, in the way in which detainees are treated, and other issues of that nature. So this is the first thing that we call for. The second one is, out of this conflict, as out of many others, the ICRC again is clear about the fact that much more has to be done to prevent armed conflicts and to resolve them.
The loss of humanitarian workers in the Gaza conflict has been such a devastating one. How would you avoid losses of human lives like that among your colleagues? It is a big challenge, I would assume, right now also.
Well, first of all, we should call all of us on all actors, states or non-state armed groups in conflict environment, to remember that humanitarian workers are not taking sides. We are there because there are lives to be protected, there's medical assistance to be provided, there's water and food supplies that are needed for communities, and there we need humanitarian organizations and staff to be respected. We are not targets, and we are not there to take sides or to interfere in the conflict itself. So the fact that there have been such repeated attacks against or injuries of humanitarian workers and the deaths of many as well in several conflicts of the Middle East, but also in Africa. The ICRC also recently lost colleagues again. It is a reminder, first of all, of how dangerous these environments are, but also requires a repeated call to parties to better respect humanitarian workers, because at the end of the day, if that safety isn't given, our work becomes increasingly difficult.
That's clearly written in the Geneva Convention, and this year celebrates the 75th anniversary of that. And yet, some argue it is even more dangerous today than 75 years ago when that convention did not exist, because at the time it was the problem because there was no convention like that. But now relevant parties try to ignore these conventions and rules and regulations, but only look at their own self-interest. So from your perspective, what is going on here? What's wrong with us now?
I think sometimes we take certain things for granted. And you're right to point to the fact that in 1949, when the Geneva Conventions were adopted, the people who sat around the table to negotiate those conventions had just survived World War II. So they didn't need any imagination about the limitless ability of human beings to inflict the worst possible suffering on other human beings. So they created this minimum basis of humanity through the Geneva Conventions. In fact, every time I open the Geneva Conventions, I'm reminded there's nothing theoretical in them. Every page, every article comes from a lived experience of horror. And these articles were described and written and approved and ratified because states were clear about the fact that certain limits have to exist in times of war. It is not acceptable to behave without respecting those rules. And what we see is that every time these rules are disrespected, the paradox is that the pursuit of peace or of a positive resolution of the situation becomes more complicated, not less. So we really need voices every day to make international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions a political priority, a priority for humanity.
When you look at the Geneva Convention, especially for the humanitarian organizations like you, impartiality and neutrality is extremely important. But there are debates about what exactly is impartiality, what exactly is neutrality, particularly out of the current circumstances. How do you see these renewed so-called debates?
Also, in my personal experience of working in these conflicts, I've often been faced with questions or criticism about neutrality. So I understand that the debate is necessary. And I understand it because when you are caught up in a war, in other words, you have an opponent or an enemy on the other side, you don't like an organization to say there are two sides and we cross the lines and we talk to everybody. But the ICRC's way of working, our Red Cross way of working, is that we do talk to everybody, we do cross lines. But why do we do it? We believe in neutrality because it allows us to go further. So for example, if you are in Gaza today, you wouldn't be as an organization in Gaza if the parties didn't accept that you are neutral. You wouldn't be in Ukraine today, or we wouldn't be in Congo either, if the parties thought that we are on one side. It just doesn't work in the humanitarian. It's certainly not our way of working. So we believe in neutrality because it allows us to do more.
How do you see the latest development, for example, between China and France when the two presidents met, and they also mentioned about their consensus on trying to build a ceasefire in the Middle East regarding Gaza? Many of those being reached in their final documents has something to do with supporting humanitarian organizations and humanitarian work.
So I think it's very significant when states raise issues, first of all, about the need to respect civilian populations, to respect detainees, to respect international humanitarian law, and to respect the access for humanitarian organizations to these contexts. And I think when I reflect on that, last year when President Xi Jinping met and received the ICRC President, Mirjana Spoljaric, there was a very significant moment in that meeting when President Xi highlighted the fact that humanitarianism was this great consensus. And in a sense, the illustration of that lies in the fact that China has also been highlighting repeatedly its attachment to respect of international humanitarian law, its emphasis on the need to protect civilians, to respect and safeguard prisoners of war, etc. And in the case of this conflict between Israel and Hamas, we see, of course, the importance that it has, first of all, to respect the rules of armed conflict, but also to have states highlight the importance of finding solutions, because the human cost of any conflict, but of this conflict in particular, is so extreme that it requires a lot of engagement and a political resolution.
How do you see China is trying to carve out its role to support humanitarian works around the world?
What is important is that there is an attempt to provide mediation to preserve the dialogue between parties in a conflict, to highlight the need for all parties to respect international humanitarian law. This type of messaging is indeed very important, and this is a messaging that China has been putting forward on the conflict in Ukraine. It has also now continued to raise these issues around the conflict between Israel and Hamas. These are messages that in international settings, also in New York, in the Security Council, at the General Assembly debates, it is very important for ICRC to see states take these messages. So this is significant. And again, also in our dialogue, this explains why I see a very important role in the dialogue that ICRC can have with China in highlighting the suffering that exists in so many conflict environments, the need for new ideas when it comes to preserving space for humanitarian action, but also for new ideas when it comes to preventing conflict or resolving conflicts.
Earlier, we see China try to play a significant role in bringing Iran and Saudi Arabia closer together. Of course, these are important stakeholders in the Middle East. And now recently, we also saw the dialogue taking place in Beijing between Fatah and also Hamas. So how do you see these kinds of diplomatic actions or trends are likely to help you as a humanitarian organization to work on some of the most urgent humanitarian works and crises?
So one message that we have for states in general and that we bring up in the dialogue with China is that this firm belief that dialogue is important, that trying to resolve conflicts, to bring parties together is important. That's not a role that the ICRC plays because we are not a political actor. The link that I see to ICRC's work is that we believe that there is a complementarity in efforts to try and bring about dialogue between parties, and the role that the ICRC plays in what we call our neutral intermediary role.
Another thing is about new technologies. You mentioned also in your earlier work of planning for the organization, artificial intelligence and many other new technologies are bringing more new momentum for resolving conflict. But they can also be tools for escalating conflicts, for example, with weaponry and etc. So how would ICRC as a humanitarian organization tap into these resources and say this can be on our advantage?
Exactly. So we have many different ways of benefiting from new technologies, both, of course, inside organizations and how we function and becoming more agile in our organizational design and how we approach things. But it is true, they represent also a challenge. It's often like this in life, right?
Yes.
A new discovery has a great positive effect, but it has potentially devastating effects as well. And we have seen in the case of conflicts like Ukraine, but also in Gaza, how new technologies are applied to conflict environments. And that raises real questions that the Geneva Conventions maybe had not anticipated when they were drafted, but the rules of the Geneva Conventions also apply to these new weapons. So you cannot say, oh, I'm conducting war with new technologies, therefore the Geneva Conventions don't apply. No, you have to apply the Geneva Conventions in good faith to the use of those new technologies.
China. This year is an important year for the China Red Cross. ICRC has been working with China for decades. Now, how do you see the evolution of China's Red Cross in working with you and the maturity of a humanitarian organization from China?
So I personally have enjoyed many rounds of discussion with the leadership of the Red Cross Society of China, and I've found the developments in our strategic partnership very encouraging. I want to give an example. The Red Cross Society of China has invested through its International Academy of the Red Cross in important initiatives on promotion and debate around international humanitarian law. This has offered us a space jointly in China, but also with international participation, to raise issues, to explain what the ICRC's work is about, why the Geneva Conventions are important and others. And the Red Cross has taken a really important leadership here in China on these topics. It's also true that the Red Cross Society of China has supported ICRC increasingly on our international operations. So whether it was supporting our activities in the context like Afghanistan or Ukraine, this is something that has benefited us greatly. And so I really think that development is one of something to really look forward to, and I'm really keen that we build that into the next phase, also based on the recognition that came from the meeting again between our president and President Xi Jinping last year, where the message from President Xi Jinping about the recognition of ICRC's work, but also of the importance of international humanitarian law was emphasized, and I think that gives both the Red Cross Society of China and the ICRC an important opportunity to develop this further.
Mr. Director General, what a pleasure to see you in Beijing. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure.